The red light flashed again and again across the metal walls of the alien ship, and loud alarms echoed through the dark corridors where strange shadows moved quickly, and voices whispered in a strange language that no human had ever heard before. And in the middle of it all, a girl named Lena was dragged by two tall creatures with long arms, sharp claws, and skin looked like black glass under the lights. Lena was weak and bleeding from her forehead and arms, and her legs felt broken, but her eyes were still full of fire and anger and pain, and she did not cry or scream, and she just looked forward without blinking while the aliens pulled her toward a locked chamber made of smooth silver and full of cold light that burned her skin just by touching it. She had been a science intern on the Earthship Nova Star, which was on a peaceful mission to study a strange signal coming from deep space, and the crew had been friendly and kind, and Lena had always dreamed of space since she was a child, and her father had told her stories about the stars, and now she was here, but not in the way she ever wanted. Nova Star was attacked 3 days ago by something fast and silent and full of weapons and fear, and before anyone could react, the whole crew was either dead or taken, and Lena had been one of the unlucky ones who survived the first blast, only to be captured and brought here, where the air smelled like metal and the screams never stopped. Now she was inside the chamber, and the door closed behind her, and the aliens placed her in a strange chair with tight straps and cold metal arms that moved on their own, and needles that went into her neck, arms, legs, and spine, and her mouth opened, but no sound came out, and her eyes rolled back, but she stayed awake through it all because she wanted to remember. She wanted to remember their faces and their strange eyes and their cruel hands, because she promised herself if she ever got free, she would make them pay, even if it cost her everything, and even if she died doing it. The aliens began asking questions in a language that hurt her ears, and they pushed images into her brain and tried to find something inside her, but she did not know what they wanted. And she screamed as something burned inside her chest, and the pain went beyond anything she had ever known. But she still did not give them what they wanted, because she had nothing to give. Minutes passed like hours, and her body started to give up, and her heartbeat slowed down, and her skin turned pale, and her breath stopped, and the machines around her made sharp warning sounds, and the aliens checked her pulse and saw that she was gone, and one of them clicked its teeth and turned away. Like it was disappointed, they left her body there cold and lifeless, and the lights dimmed in the chamber, and the machines turned off, and everything became quiet except for one low hum from the corner of the room where a strange symbol blinked faintly on the screen, like it was waiting. 37 minutes passed in silence, and then her fingers twitched once, then again, and her body shivered like something inside was waking up, and her eyes snapped open, but they were no longer just human, because now they glowed with a strange silver light that reflected the cold walls of the chamber, and her face showed no pain, only purpose. She sat up slowly without help and pulled the wires from her body and stood in the middle of the room with her fists clenched, and something inside her whispered her name like a memory from another life, and her voice was soft but full of something ancient as she said, "I am Lena, and I remember everything." On the other side of the door, the aliens stopped walking as if they felt something was wrong, and one of them reached toward the control panel, but before it could touch the buttons, the chamber lights exploded, and the door bent inward like it had been hit by something strong and impossible. Lena stepped out into the corridor, her body glowing faintly, and the air around her was heavy like thunder before a storm, and the aliens backed away for the first time. Not in control, not confident, not safe, because they saw something in her eyes that they did not expect. She was no longer the girl they had taken from the ship, no longer the weak prisoner they had tortured, no longer the small voice crying for help in the dark. Now she was something more, and something old, and something they could not explain, and she was just getting started. The hallway was silent and cold as Lena walked forward slowly with bare feet touching the smooth alien floor, and her skin shining with a silver glow that pulsed like a heartbeat, and the lights above flickered as if afraid to stay on in her presence. and the two aliens who had once dragged her now stood frozen against the wall with fear in their black eyes and weapons. Shaking in their hands, she looked at them without hate and without mercy. As if they were nothing more than shadows from a dream, she no longer feared, and when one of them raised a gun and pointed it at her, she simply blinked, and the weapon melted in his grip like hot wax, and the alien screamed as the metal burned into his skin, and he fell to the ground whimpering in a language Lena now somehow understood. She kept walking as doors opened on their own, and the lights bowed in waves, and somewhere deep inside her head, a voice whispered again and again, like a river flowing through old stone, and it said, "We are here, we never left, we only slept, and you are the gate, and we will protect you as long as you walk the path." She did not remember the voice from her past, but it felt like home, and pain and truth all mixed together, and with every step her mind opened more and more, like a book that had been locked for years, and now revealed its pages one by one, and inside were things she did not understand yet still knew were hers. She reached a chamber filled with screens showing alien text and stars and strange symbols, and as she walked in, the machines turned on without touch, and the lights formed a circle around her, and the voice inside her head spoke louder, now saying, "Access granted. Subject identified, activating sequence protocol." And then a blue beam of light fell over her and showed her visions from long ago. She saw Earth not as it is, but as it was, full of lights and towers and ships that could move faster than anything she had seen, and people in armor standing proud with strange glowing marks on their arms, and a great war in space, where human ships fought the same aliens who now held her, and she saw something terrible, a last message hidden in code and sent far into space, and a final order: protect the spark at all costs. She realized then that she was the spark, and her body had been chosen long ago by something old and hidden, and when the aliens tortured her, they had triggered a sleeping system inside her DNA that connected to this ancient force now waking from its long rest. Door behind her opened, and a group of aliens entered with weapons raised in fear in their movements, and they shouted orders at her, and she raised her hands slowly and spoke in their language without thinking, and said, "Do not come closer, or you will fall like the others." And they stopped, confused and afraid, because her voice did not sound human anymore, but like a chorus of many voices speaking as one. One of the aliens stepped forward and said, "You should be dead. You are just a girl." And she answered, "I was a girl. I was weak. I was alone, but now I am something you do not understand, and that is why you are afraid." And she stepped forward once more, and the ground beneath her cracked, and the lights above burst like glass under pressure. Machines in the room began to change their shape and move as if alive, and they formed a map of the galaxy above her head with one bright point blinking in red. And the voice said, "Target located, memory unlocked, prepare for return to origin." And Lena looked at the red point and felt something calling her home, but not to Earth, to something else hidden beyond the stars. She turned to the screens and raised her hand, and the symbols shifted and obeyed, and she saw files written in old Earth code, and one word repeated again and again: "Sleeper, sleeper, sleeper." And next to it, a name she had never heard, but knew was hers: Lena 07. The truth hit her like a storm without warning. She was not just human, not just a survivor. She was created for this, born for this, chosen for this. And her death had been the key that opened the door, and now the door would not close again. Alarms started to ring across the ship, and voices shouted over speakers in panic, and the floor vibrated as the ship moved through space, trying to escape something or someone. But Lena did not move, because she was not afraid anymore, and because she knew that she was the danger. Now one of the screens showed a message in red that said, "Warning, internal systems breached, unknown program active," and the voice in her mind said gently, "You are not alone. We will guide you, we will fight with you. We are the lost memory of your people, and we have waited long enough." She stepped into the center of the room and let the machines surround her as the map above changed and showed more red lights across the stars, and each one a place where her kind had once lived and lost, and now maybe could return. The door opened once more, and this time a human face stepped in wearing alien armor and eyes wide with shock, and Lena stared at him and said quietly, "You are from Earth." And he nodded slowly and said, "We thought you were just a myth." And she smiled with no joy and said, "No, I am not a myth, I am the beginning." The man stood at the door in silence as if time itself had frozen, and behind him the alarms still screamed and the ship shook from something outside, but he did not move and his eyes stayed fixed on Lena, who stood tall in the center of the glowing room with silver light around her like fire that did not burn, and between them something passed not in words but in memory. Like a thread pulled from a forgotten dream, he was human but changed, his body marked with scars and armor that looked alien. And Earth made together, and he spoke with a voice deep and careful like someone who had been afraid for too long and now found hope in the shape of a girl who should not exist. And he said softly, "We heard stories of you from the old code, from whispers in broken ships, from dying machines who spoke your name before they shut down forever." Lena watched him and felt no fear because something inside her now understood his words, not just from his mouth but from his soul, and she said, "You carry the memory of Earth like I do." And he nodded and stepped closer, still watching her like a soldier in front of a legend, and said, "They told us one day a spark would rise again and burn away the darkness, and maybe now the time has come." She reached out her hand and he took it slowly, and when their skin touched, the ship responded as if their connection awakened something greater, and the walls pulsed with a deep blue light, and the symbols above them changed, showing not just stars but faces and moments and battles long gone, and all of them filled with the sound of one word: again and again. Awaken. The voice in her head returned louder now and filled with strength, and it said, "You are not one, you are many. You are the echo of a forgotten war and the seed of a future still waiting to be born, and we are your memory, your shield, your fire, and with you we shall rise again." Lena closed her eyes and let the voice show her more, and suddenly she was not standing in a ship but floating in space, watching Earth from far away as it burned in fire long ago, and the skies filled with ships like dark birds, and human voices crying and fighting and building and falling and always coming back again. And she saw herself in many forms and many times, like her soul had walked these paths before and now returned one last time to finish what others could not. She opened her eyes, and the man was kneeling in front of her, not in worship but in understanding, and he said, "I am Kale, born on Mars, raised in the shadows. I have waited all my life for this moment, and now I will follow you to the end." And Lena said, "Then rise, Kale, and stand beside me, because I will not walk this road alone." More doors opened, and more humans entered, some broken, some tired, all carrying marks of war and loss. And when they saw Lena, they stopped and looked with wide eyes and quiet hearts, and one by one they lowered their weapons and bowed their heads, not in fear but in hope, because something in them remembered what their ancestors once were. Before the silence, before the fall, the voice inside Lena spoke again, but now it was mixed with her own voice, and it said together, "We are stronger, and the past shall not be buried, and the future shall not be stolen. And we will fight not for revenge, but for memory, and for truth, and for the right to be free once more." The lights in the room grew brighter, and the ship stopped shaking as the systems came under Lena's control, and the maps in the air zoomed in to show a planet not far away, and it was Earth, but changed and covered in machines and towers that reached the sky. And Lena knew that her journey was leading there, not just to find answers, but to wake others like her who still slept. She turned to Kale and said, "Prepare the ship, gather those who still believe we are going home." And Kale smiled for the first time and said, "We never stopped believing, we only forgot how to speak it aloud." Outside, the ship stars began to move as if space itself was shifting, and Lena looked out the window and saw a shape in the distance, massive and ancient and hidden in shadows, and the voice inside her whispered, "It is time." And she nodded once and said, "Then let the old ones come. I am not afraid." The crew began to work quickly as lights changed to green and engines hummed with energy, and the ship turned toward Earth, while behind them the stars watched in silence, and far away in a forgotten corner of space, another signal blinked for the first time. In years, and machines once dead began to move as if listening to a call they had long waited for. In the center of it all, Lena stood calm and bright with a fire in her heart that no cage could hold and no fear could touch, and she whispered to herself, "I am not the end, I am the beginning again." The stars outside turned red as the ship crossed into forbidden space where machines drifted like bones of giants, and broken satellites spun in silence, and debris floated across the path like forgotten memories. And the Earth that waited ahead was not the Earth from stories and dreams, but a silent world wrapped in chains of light and towers, built by hands not human. Lena stood on the command deck, her eyes glowing with the same light that now flowed through the walls, and her voice echoed not just through speakers but through systems and wires and circuits, as if the ship itself listened to her like a child to a mother. And Kale stood beside her, reading reports from the lower levels where more humans had woken from cryosleep with no memory but full of fear and fire. Crew was small and the ship was old, but now something new moved through its heart, something ancient and awake and ready. And when Lena raised her hand, the screens changed and showed the city called Obsidian 1 floating above Earth like a black crown, filled with soldiers and machines and strange towers that hummed with alien power. And deep inside it, a prison where humans were kept like ghosts. Kale said they control the minds of many now with false dreams and false peace, and most do not even remember that they are prisoners. And Lena said, "Then we will remind them, we will break the dream and show them the sky." The plan was made quickly because time was short and danger was near, and Lena knew the longer they waited, the stronger the enemy became. And already ships were moving from Earth toward them, drawn by signals and alarms, and something else, something older and darker, that still slept beneath the cities and waited to rise again. They entered the lower level where prisoners sat in rows and looked at the walls with empty eyes, and machines whispered to them through wires connected to their necks. And Kale said, "These are the lost ones, taken before birth and raised without truth." And Lena walked among them, her light touching each one, and the machines sparked and broke, and the wires fell away, and eyes began to blink, and tears began to fall. A small girl reached for Lena with shaking fingers and said in a soft voice, "I dreamed of the stars, and I saw you there." And Lena bent down and held her and said that dream was real, and now you are free. And the girl smiled like the sun after a storm. Kale pressed a button on his wrist, and doors opened and weapons were brought out, simple and strong and old, but still ready for war. And Lena touched one and memories flooded back, not hers, but from before, like hands holding the same weapon in another battle and another life. And she said, "We have done this before, and we will do it again." The ship moved fast now, dodging blasts from the enemy as they reached the lower orbit, and alarms screamed again, and Kale shouted, "Shields failing, engines burning." And Lena said, "Hold course and do not stop, because fear is not our master and pain is not our cage." The city Obsidian 1 loomed ahead, and its gates opened like jaws, ready to swallow, and the crew braced for the crash as the ship broke through the outer walls and flames lit the sky, and the old engines died with one last scream, and silence followed as the dust cleared and the ship lay broken inside the enemy's heart. But from the wreckage rose light and voices and footsteps and fire, because Lena was still standing, and her people followed with eyes wide open and weapons ready and hearts full of something more than rage, something that had no name but burned brighter than hope. The corridors of the city were wide and cold and filled with machines that tried to stop them, but each time Lena raised her hand and the machines turned to ash. And Kale led the fighters through shadows and doors and down into the core, where the signal came from, and where the truth was hidden. They found a chamber deep below, where a human mind was trapped inside a machine, and it spoke in broken words and said, "I am code, I am voice, I was once free." And Lena said, "We are here to free you again." And the machine said, "Then awaken the others, and break the circle, and end the Silence. Lena reached into the machine with her hand, and light poured out and screens shattered, and across the city alarms turned to silence as the control broke and millions of minds blinked and gasped and remembered who they were and what had been taken outside. The sky turned bright as more ships came, not to fight, but to follow, because they saw the signal and felt the change. And across Earth, towers fell and machines stopped, and voices rose not in fear but in song. And Kale stood on the edge of the city and looked at the horizon and said, the uprising has begun. And Lena stood beside him and said, not uprising, awakening. Smoke still rose from the towers of Obsidian One as the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in years, and the ground shook with the footsteps of people who had just remembered how to walk and how to breathe and how to speak their names again. And in the center of the ruined city, Lena stood like a flame that would not die, and her eyes held a storm that no wind could move. She had not slept since the battle began, and yet she did not grow tired, because something ancient now moved inside her, and it whispered always in a voice both calm and wild, and it said, we have waited and we have watched, and now the fire must rise and the chain must break, and the end must come before the new beginning can grow. Kale walked beside her with new scars on his arms and a calm fire in his chest, and he said, we have won the city, but Earth is wide and the sky is full of enemies. And Lena said, then we will rise higher than the sky and strike faster than fear and deeper than memory. And Kale nodded without another word, because he knew this was no longer a simple fight. They returned to the heart of the city, where the old machine still whispered, and where files long hidden now lay, open and glowing with symbols written in code made by humans who lived before the silence and lost everything to keep the truth alive. And Lena placed her hand on the panel, and the voice inside her said one word with force so strong the walls trembled, and that word was protocol. Everything around her froze as if time had paused to listen, and the lights above shifted to red, and the ground opened below her feet, and a new chamber revealed itself, filled with mirrors that did not show faces but futures, and at the center a black cube pulsing like a heart made of stars. And she stepped toward it without fear and placed both hands upon it. Voice returned, now stronger and clearer than ever, and it said, revenge protocol active, initiate sequence, unlock memory stream. And Lena gasped as visions struck her mind like thunder, and she saw herself standing in front of 1,000 ships, all marked with the same symbol that now burned on her palm. And she saw a war so wide it wrapped the stars, and a peace so short it vanished like smoke. The cube melted into her skin and vanished, and something deep inside her cracked and rebuilt, and the light in her eyes grew so bright even Kale stepped back and said softly, what have you become? And Lena answered, not with pride or fear, but with purpose. And she said, I have become what they were afraid I would be. Every system in the city turned on at once, and the sky filled with light and messages sent across old networks, and ancient satellites and ships long buried in dust opened their eyes again and answered her call, and one by one they came from the shadows of space, drawn by the signal of the protocol and the voice of the last living fire of the old world. Kale watched in awe as screens filled with names of ships and places and commanders thought dead, and he said, this is not just an uprising, this is a resurrection. And Lena looked at him and said, it is not over, because the ones who did this still rule the stars, and they will come for us, and they will burn every world we touch unless we strike first. Across the planet humans woke from dreams made by machines, and they looked to the sky and saw hope written in fire. And they rose not with hatred but with memory, and not with revenge but with justice, and they began to march toward the cities where the false peace still held, and the towers still whispered lies. The enemy saw the signal too, and they moved quickly from their deep space stations and hidden moons, and sent their strongest ships to silence the fire before it could spread. And Lena stood in the highest tower of Obsidian One and watched them come, and said, let them come, let them see what we have become. Kale brought the message from the edge of the network and said, the supreme command is awake, and they have launched a weapon older than time, and Lena turned her eyes to the stars and said, then we must awaken something even older, something buried not in space, but in blood and memory and truth. She walked to the chamber below the city where a secret vault held the final key, and as she stepped inside, the walls glowed with her presence and opened without command, and inside was a suit of armor not made by hands, but by thought and flame and time, and when she wore it, the ship above responded with a sound like thunder, and the voice said, protocol complete, all systems ready for engagement. She rose into the sky with her people behind her and the stars waiting ahead, and she said, this is not war, this is remembrance, and the light around her turned gold, and the first ships lifted from the ground like birds waking from a long dark sleep, and as the stars began to move and the air turned quiet, Kale looked up and said, she is no longer just a girl, she is a weapon built by memory and born from fire, and now the galaxy will remember what it means to fear the forgotten asterisk. The sky above burned with silver light as ships, once lost, now flew again in perfect lines, cutting through clouds like blades of memory, and below them the ground shook as towers fell and cities cried, and humans opened their eyes to a world they had forgotten. And in the center of it all, Lena stood like a star made of fire and promise, wearing armor that pulsed with energy older than history and brighter than the bow. First sunrise, she did not speak because the voice within her now spoke for her through systems and screens and minds that had once been silent everywhere. Her message spread like wind over dry leaves, awakening sparks buried under dust and time. And across Earth, humans began to rise, not as soldiers, not as rebels, but as something new and something true. Kale stood at the edge of the control chamber, watching as the old world burned and the new one crawled from its ashes, and he said softly, we are going home. And Lena turned to him, her eyes no longer silver but gold and burning, and she said, we never left, only forgot the way back. They entered the main ship, once a graveyard, now reborn and powered by a core taken from the ruins of Obsidian One, and as they rose into orbit, the Earth below looked both beautiful and broken, like a song that had lost its final note. And Kale said, what do we do if they do not remember who they are? And Lena said, then we remind them with truth, with light, with pain if we must, but we will remind them. The cities ahead were not like the others. They were clean and perfect, and full of peace that was false, and smiles that were controlled, and lives that were watched. And in the center of the largest one stood the throne tower built by the Supreme Command, where the first chain had been placed and where the last lock would be broken. Lena closed her eyes and reached into the stars with her mind, and ships moved without orders, and lights changed without commands, and the systems of Earth that had once served the enemy now turned slowly toward her. And Kale watched with awe and said, you are not leading them, you are becoming them. And Lena said, I do not lead, I carry them, I remember them, I am there. Voice. They landed in silence on the edge of the capital, and no alarm sounded, because the systems were blind to her, now as if even the machines had begun to doubt their masters. And Lena stepped out onto the black stone path, and the people there stopped walking and turned and stared with eyes full of confusion and fear and hope, and something older than all three. She raised her hand, and the ground beneath her feet shifted, and symbols appeared glowing bright red, and the voice inside her spoke again, not in words but in memory and pain and light. And one by one the watchers fell to their knees, not in surrender, but in recognition, because deep inside they knew her, even if they did not understand why. Kale moved beside her, holding the old weapon now changed by her touch, and said, the tower is waking, it knows you are here. And Lena said, then let it wake, and let it speak, and let it remember what it did, and what we became because of it. They entered the tower with no resistance, because the walls opened and the lights followed, and at the top stood the last guardian, not a soldier, not a machine, but a man old and still and wearing white robes that flowed like water. And he looked at Lena and said, you should not exist. And Lena said, I exist because of what you did and because of what you tried to erase. The man stepped forward with no fear and said, we made peace, we ended war, we brought order. And Lena said, you buried freedom, you killed memory, You replaced truth with control. And now I have come to return what was lost. He reached for a device at his side, and the walls began to shake, and voices cried out in pain, and the ground split open. But Lena stood without moving, and the light around her grew brighter, and she said, "You cannot stop what has already awakened. You cannot silence what is already screaming." Kale raised his weapon, but Lena stopped him with a look and said, "This fight is not of fists or fire. It is of truth and silence, and only one can remain." And then she stepped forward and placed her hand on the final seal, and the room exploded with light. In that moment, across Earth, machines shut down and minds cleared, and systems broke, and the chains fell from necks, and the tower cracked from top to base. And the old man fell to his knees and said, "What have you done?" And Lena answered, "I have done what you feared. I have given them back their voice." Earth sighed like something sleeping for centuries had taken its first breath, and the people came out of their homes and looked at the sky, and for the first time they saw not just stars, but freedom. And Kale turned to Lena and said, "You did it." And she said, "No, we did it. And now comes the hardest part. Now we rebuild." The wind carried dust across the broken towers of the old cities, and light filtered through the clouds, as if the sky itself was waking from a long dark sleep, and the people below stood in silence, with their eyes turned upward, watching as the stars above began to move in patterns not seen for generations. And in the heart of it all stood Lena. Her armor cracked, her hands bruised, her breath steady, and her voice calm like a river cutting through stone. The supreme command had fallen, but the war was not over, because in the deep corners of space old enemies still waited, still watched, still built, and now they stirred as the signal reached them, and their machines blinked awake with red eyes, and their ships rose from the shadows with engines full of silence and hate, and they came not to conquer, but to erase. Gale stood beside Lena, reading reports from the outer systems, where resistance cells were forming, where long-lost colonies were rising, where forgotten outposts now answered the call with fire and faith. And he said, "They are coming with everything." And Lena said, "Then so are we." They moved to the command ship, once a graveyard, now a fortress powered by memory and pain, and the people gathered there were no longer just survivors. They were warriors, they were engineers, they were builders of a future written not by fear, but by truth. And as Lena stepped onto the deck, they all turned and raised their fists, not in anger, but in unity. The voice inside her had grown quiet, not gone, but watching, and she knew now that it had never been a machine or a code, but a memory passed through blood, through story, through fire, and that she was not chosen by fate but by sacrifice, and she carried not a destiny, but a duty. Kale opened the central map, and lights flickered, showing enemy ships moving fast through the void, and red marks appearing closer each hour. And Lena placed her hand on the table and said, "We do not wait, we strike. We remind them what humanity truly is." Ships began to move, forming lines like wings across the stars, and each one carried a crew who had tasted freedom and would never let it go again. And from every direction, messages came in, voices strong and clear, saying, "We are ready, we stand, we fight." They reached the first enemy fleet near the orbit of a dead moon, and the sky turned black with smoke and metal, and the silence before battle was short, because Lena gave no speeches, Kale gave no warnings, and the enemy offered no mercy. The battle began with light so bright it looked like new stars were born, and ships danced and burned, and men and women screamed and fought, and every move carried memory, every blast carried anger, every victory carried tears. And Lena moved through it all like a storm. She boarded the lead enemy vessel with Kale and a team of fighters, and inside they found machines twisted into flesh, and eyes that had forgotten how to blink, and voices that spoke only in commands. But Lena did not hesitate, and her hands glowed, and her feet moved, and her fire burned through every wall, every code, every lie. They reached the core and found the captain, a creature not made of blood, but of wires and hatred, and it looked at her with eyes made of mirrors and said, "You are a mistake." And she said, "No, I am the reason you failed." She reached forward and touched the core, and it screamed not in sound, but in light, and the ship cracked like ice, and the machines shut down like tired hearts, and Lena walked back through the fire with her team behind her, and the ship fell into the void with no song and no name. Battles followed, and each one harder than the last, and some ships were lost, and some names were buried, and each time Lena stood at the front not as a queen or a god, but as a memory, a symbol, a voice, and her people followed not because they feared her, but because they believed in what she believed. That humanity was not perfect, not pure, not peaceful, but it was alive and wild and brave and full of fire that no darkness could ever kill. The final battle came near the edge of known space, where an ancient gate waited, forgotten by time and guarded by machines that had not moved in 1,000 years, and now they woke, and now they attacked, and now they screamed. But Lena was already there, and she had already seen this place in her dreams. Fought with everything they had, with every weapon, every word, every heartbeat, and when it ended the gate stood open, and behind its stars shined brighter than ever, and silence fell across the field, not in fear, but in peace. Lena stepped forward, looked back at Kale and all who had followed, and said, "We are not finished, but we are free, and now we build not walls but bridges, not empires but homes, not weapons but songs." The stars watched, and the ships returned, and the people sang, and the voice inside her whispered once more, not with pain, not with power, but with pride, "You are not the spark, you are the fire forever."